The torches flickered against the ancient walls of Rome as the summer heat pressed down upon the eternal city. It was August in the year 410, and the greatest civilization the Western world had ever known stood on the precipice of an unthinkable catastrophe. For 800 years, no foreign army had breached these walls. For 8 centuries, Rome had remained inviolate, a symbol of power so absolute that its citizens believed it would stand forever. But on this night, everything changed. The gates would open, the barbarians would pour through, and an empire that had shaped the destiny of millions would begin its final, irreversible collapse. The man who would bring Rome to its knees was not born a conqueror. Alaric came into the world around 370 in the region near the mouth of the Danube River, in territory that straddled the boundary between the Roman Empire and the vast wilderness beyond. He was a Visigoth, a member of the Gothic peoples who had for generations existed in a complicated relationship with Rome, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, and increasingly as refugees fleeing the terrifying Hunnic invasions sweeping westward across the steppes. As a young man, Alaric had served in the Roman army, fighting alongside legionnaires against other barbarian threats. He had learned Roman tactics, understood Roman weaknesses, and developed an intimate knowledge of the empire's inner workings. This education would prove fatal to Rome itself. The decades leading up to that August night had been ones of mounting crisis for the Western Roman Empire. The empire had formally divided into eastern and western halves in 395, and the western portion, ruled from Ravenna rather than Rome itself, faced threats on every frontier. The Rhine had frozen solid in the bitter winter of 406, allowing hundreds of thousands of Vandals, Alans, and Suevi to cross into Gaul virtually unopposed. Britain had been abandoned, its legions withdrawn to defend territories closer to the imperial heartland. The economy was in shambles, the currency debased, and the once mighty legions were increasingly staffed by the very barbarian peoples they were meant to fight against. The empire was hemorrhaging from 1,000 wounds, and its leaders seemed incapable of stopping the bleeding. Alaric had spent years negotiating with the Western Roman government, seeking a permanent homeland for his people and an official position for himself within the imperial hierarchy. He wanted legitimacy, recognition, and security for the Visigoths who followed him. Time and again, he believed he had reached an agreement, only to see it undermined by court intrigues, broken promises, and the arrogance of Roman officials who viewed all barbarians as beneath contempt, regardless of their military service or political reliability. The general Stilicho, himself of barbarian origin, had been one of the few Roman leaders capable of managing the relationship with Alaric. But in 408, Stilicho fell victim to a palace coup and was executed. With his death, any hope of peaceful accommodation vanished. The Emperor Honorius, who ruled the Western Empire from behind the impregnable marshes of Ravenna, was by all accounts spectacularly unsuited for his position. Historical accounts describe him as more interested in his poultry than in governance, allegedly more distressed by the death of a favorite chicken named Roma than by the fate of the city that shared its name. Whether this story is literally true or merely illustrative of his character, the consensus among historians is that Honorius was weak, indecisive, and utterly dependent on advisors who themselves were often corrupt or incompetent. When Alaric sought negotiations, Honorius rebuffed him. When Alaric demonstrated his power by marching on Rome itself, Honorius remained safely distant, offering neither battle nor reasonable terms for peace. Alaric besieged Rome 3 times. The first siege, in 408, brought the city to the edge of starvation. The Senate agreed to pay an enormous ransom in gold, silver, silt, and pepper, and Alaric withdrew, believing that surely now the emperor would negotiate seriously. He was wrong. The second siege came in 409, when Alaric attempted a different strategy, setting up a puppet emperor named Priscus Attalus in an attempt to force Honorius to the table. This too failed, as Attalus proved useless and Honorius remained obstinate. By the summer of 410, Alaric had run out of patience and options. His people were hungry, his position was increasingly desperate, and it had become clear that the only way to force the Western Empire to take him seriously was to do the unthinkable. On the night of August 24th, 410, the Salarian Gate of Rome swung open. Historical accounts suggest that Gothic slaves within the city, sympathetic to their kinsmen outside the walls, managed to unlock the gate under cover of darkness. Some sources mention a noble Roman woman named Proba, who allegedly ordered her slaves to open the gate, though this detail remains disputed. What is certain is that the massive wooden doors opened, and Alaric's Visigoths poured into the city that had ruled the known world. What followed was 3 days of systematic plunder. The Visigoths, being Christians themselves, largely spared churches and those who sought sanctuary within them. The great basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul provided refuge for many Romans, and Alaric reportedly gave orders that these holy places were to remain inviolate. But outside church walls, the city was given over to the conquerors. Homes of the wealthy were stripped of valuables. Warehouses were emptied. Slaves were taken. Some violence certainly occurred, as it always does when armies enter cities, though contemporary accounts suggest the sack was less brutal than it might have been. The Visigoths were seeking treasure and provisions, not extermination. Among the captives taken during the sack was a young woman named Galla Placidia, the half-sister of Emperor Honorius himself. She would eventually marry Alaric's successor, Ataulf, in a union that represented a strange melding of Roman and Gothic nobility. Her story would continue through decades of imperial politics, eventually seeing her son Valentinian III become emperor. But on that August night, she was simply another prize, carried off by the barbarian host. The physical damage to Rome, while significant, was perhaps less catastrophic than the psychological impact of the event. Rome had been sacked before, of course, most famously by the Gauls under Brennus in 390 BC. But that had been 8 centuries earlier, in the city's youth, before Rome had conquered the Mediterranean world and established itself as the center of civilization. The Rome that fell in 410 was a symbol more than a strategic target. He lamented that the city which had conquered the world had itself been conquered, that the light which had illuminated all lands had been extinguished. And that Christians should place their hope in the eternal city of heaven rather than in any human institution. Killing the slaves who had done the work, so that no one would ever find and desecrate his grave. His brother-in-law, Ataulf, assumed leadership of the Visigoths, and eventually led them into Gaul and then Spain, where they would establish a kingdom that lasted for centuries. The Western Roman Empire staggered on for another 66 years after the sack of Rome, but it never truly recovered. The psychological blow was matched by practical consequences, as provinces increasingly looked to their own defense. When the last Western emperor, the boy Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian general Odoacer in 476, It was almost an anticlimax. The institutions of classical civilization, from public baths to professional armies to urban infrastructure, gradually collapsed and were replaced by the manorial economy and feudal political structures of the Middle Ages. The Christian Church, which had grown strong under imperial patronage, now found itself as the primary institution, providing continuity and education across a fragmented continent. Bishops became political leaders as much as spiritual ones, and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, gradually assumed authority that once belonged to emperors. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged from the ruins of the Western Empire represented not simple conquest, but a complex process of fusion between Roman and Germanic cultures. The Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths, and later the Lombards in Italy all adopted Christianity, used Latin for administration and religion, and preserved elements of Roman law and custom, even as they introduced their own traditions. The medieval world was neither simply a continuation of Rome, nor a complete break from it. Edward Gibbon famously blamed Christianity for sapping Roman martial vigor, while others have pointed to economic decline, plague, climate change, overextension, political corruption, or simply the accumulated weight of centuries of pressure from peoples beyond the frontiers. But the night of August 24th, 410, stands as a pivotal moment when the impossible became real and the unthinkable happened. Europe would eventually recover from the collapse of Roman civilization, but the recovery took centuries and produced something fundamentally different from what had come before. Standing in the ruins of that August morning, as smoke rose from burning buildings, but everyone understood that something fundamental had changed, that the world they had known was gone forever.